Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm Perry England, a building performance strategist at MacDonald-Miller. It's a pleasure meeting you here today. One of the things we're going to do is talk about the Clean Buildings Performance Standard law. And so I get the great privilege of taking you through what the law means to you as a building owner. To do that and to do it in a way that makes it as meaningful for you as possible, I'm going to cover basically the topic in three different areas. One is basically the structure of the law and how that gets applied to your building. The second piece is the compliance process, because I think it's important to at least give you an introductory overview of what that process looks like. And then one of the most important pieces is making sure that you understand what the paperwork process looks like. And so we're going to take you through a quick overview of that process as well. So on the background of the law, believe it or not, it's been around since 2019. The rules were published for Tier 1 buildings by the Department of Commerce, who is the authority having jurisdiction over the enforcement of the law, in 2020. So it's been around for several years now, and at various stages of adoption and awareness. And so that's one of the reasons why we're bringing this to you today. In 2022, one of the key elements that were implemented by our legislators is that the law was expanded to cover more buildings than just Tier 1 buildings. Just for a quick summary, Tier 1 buildings are commercial buildings greater than 50,000 square feet. That's a Tier 1 building. Tier 2, again in 2022, the law was expanded to cover buildings down to 20,000 square feet. So in essence, Tier 2 buildings are buildings between 20,000 and 50,000 gross square feet. It also incorporated multifamily buildings, whereas in Tier 1, when the law was published in 2019, multifamily buildings could opt in if they wanted to take advantage of some of the incentives, and their building was greater than 50,000. But in 2022, multifamily was brought into part of the covered properties in the law. So what are the key, what I call oftentimes referred to the key pillars of the statute, of the law? Over to your left, you have the compliance dates. Those dates go from June of 2026 for our largest of commercial buildings in the state of Washington. That's 220,000 square feet and larger, down to 2028, which is the 50 to 90,000 square feet, which have specific compliance targets that they have to achieve by those times in each one of those years. With the 2022 expansion of the law, Tier 2 buildings were part of the compliance process. And so if you have a building that's between 20 and 50,000 square feet, you have all the obligations of Tier 1 buildings, with the exception of you don't have to meet a EUI target. And I'll talk to you in just a moment about what an EUI is, but in general, it's the amount of energy your building is consuming per year per square foot. And so that is the basic calculation of an EUI. And so Tier 2 buildings have to do everything else that Tier 1 buildings do, with the exception of meeting a specific target for energy performance. The other element or other pillar of the law is there's a penalty. So there is a fine that gets assessed if you choose not to do something or you can't get your building into compliance. It's not an insignificant amount of money. There's a base fee of $5,000 plus $1 per each additional square footage. So if you have a 100,000 square foot building, you could be at risk of being assessed a $105,000 fine if you aren't able to get your building into compliance, or you choose not to do anything with compliance process. But there's also a carrot, and that carrot is an early adopter incentive. And so when the law was enacted in 2019, our legislators set aside the $75 million of incentive dollars for Tier 1 buildings. That money is applied to buildings that are, in essence, the worst performers. as measured by 15 points or greater from their calculated energy use intensity target. So it's a very selective group of buildings that incentive dollar can be acquired, that can be applied to. In 2022, when the legislators expanded the law to cover Tier 2 buildings down to 20,000 square feet, they also set aside an additional $150 million to help building owners that are at Tier 2 classification complete their paperwork and to also go through the EUI calculation process so that you know and understand what your target is, even though you don't have to meet that target, at least by 2027. That incentive dollar gets allocated at 30 cents a square foot for those buildings that apply to Commerce and the application is accepted. So with that basic understanding of the law, one of the first questions I get asked most of the time is, help me get out of this thing. And so the law does cover what is considered exemptions. You can see the list there. The state cannot imply these requirements to federal or tribal entities, and so you're automatically excluded if you meet one of those criteria. The other is your building needs to have 12 months of continuous operating data. So if you can't have 12 continuous months of operating data, energy performance data, then you aren't able to calculate your energy use intensity number. And so that's why those buildings that are either built within their 12 months of their compliance date is in essence unoccupied. As if you have less than 50% occupancy, oftentimes can be exempt. The other major exemptions are agriculture structures, so anything that has to do with our food supply and buildings that are specifically to manufacturing and industrial purposes. And there's two classifications of those types of buildings that are exempt in the legislation. The other aspect is financial hardship. You can see there a sub-list of what is considered financial hardship. And so in general, if your building is unoccupied or else is in receivership of some sort, then you have a good argument to submit to Commerce for an exemption in those situations. The nice thing that happened with the law just recently is that the legislators allowed for exemption requests to be submitted and accepted 3 years prior to your compliance date. That was a change from the initial law in 2019, which only allowed 1 year. And fortunate for us is that the Department of Commerce listened and realized that that was not enough time to know whether or not you were going to be exempt or not. And so the law was amended to allow for a 3-year submission and exemption in advance of your compliance date. So let's talk about energy use intensity now. It is maybe a new term for you, for many of you out there. And so it's really important to understand it because it is the basis of the law and how your building is being measured to what the state has established as its appropriate target. So what is energy use intensity? Pretty simple calculation, actually. It is your total annual consumption of energy, and the energy being electricity, natural gas. If you are a district energy system, such as a steam distribution system, it would consider that energy source as well. And it takes all those different types of energy sources and converts it to a common unit called a British thermal unit or a BTU, commonly referred to as a BTU. So we take that total annual energy consumption and we divide that by your building's gross floor area. So floor area, keep in mind, floor area is a denominator. And so if you don't have an accurate estimate of your accurate accounting for your floor area, you could have serious consequences in whether you're above or below your target. And you'll understand that here momentarily. So when you take those two data points, you divide them, you come up with your energy use intensity. for your building. So it's the actual measurement of energy per square foot of your specific building. And the law requires that all buildings have an Energy Star portfolio manager site set up for them to be able to track your annual EUI. So let's then, now you understand how we measure your specific building's energy performance, let's talk about how you compare that to what the state said how it should be performing. And that's getting into the calculation of your EUI, your specific building's EUI target. The state adopted the ASHRAE Standard 100. ASHRAE is a common industry trade organization that basically establishes a lot of the guidelines and standards for the HVAC industry, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning industry. And so inside this ASHRAE Standard 100, there's over 113 different space uses or space categories that are defined, and each one of those space types have a very specific energy use intensity target. And you can see an example of that based on just a sampling. Obviously, there's not 113 space types here on this one slide, but you can see the nuancing between a hospital at an EUI target of 215 versus an office building which would have an EUI target of 63. Makes a lot of sense in practice, because an office building is not a 24/7 operation like a hospital, and it doesn't have lots of one-time 100% outdoor air systems for sterilization and health infection control like a hospital does either. So its energy performance, again, its energy use per square foot is lower than that of a hospital. And you can also see a restaurant. That's another great example in contrast between an office building, but a restaurant has an EUI target of 361,000 BTUs per square foot in a given year, whereas an office building has 63,000 BTUs per square foot. There are two climate zones due to the temperature differences, the weather differences between Western Washington and Eastern Washington as separated by the Cascade Mountain Range. And you can see the adjustments that have been made based on the EUI target for each one of the space types due to the location of your property. But wait, there's more. There's some adjustments that need to be made, and that's where you would work with a qualified person to be able to go through and identify all your unique space uses in your property, its equivalent square footage, and then apply these other important notes to it. It should be noted, an important note, if your building was permanent after July 2016, then your performance of your building has to be 15% better than what the published EUI targets are in the table. The other adjustments is based on operating hours, weekly operating hours, and you can see those adjustments there. But essentially, if your building operates less than 51 hours a week, there's a downward adjustment of 0.8 in most cases. And then if your building operates basically 24/7, 24 hours, 7 days a week, you can see an upward adjustment. So your EUI target would be higher than what was published because you have extended operating hours. So let's talk about the compliance. So you got a really good understanding or a basic understanding of the law and everything that's embedded in the law. Obviously, I've covered it in a fairly high-level perspective, but with working with a qualified person, you can get into the details and how it really affects your building specifically.